Right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to join us for the launch of the Unipol and NUS Accommodation Cost Survey 2021. We're really pleased to see so many people here and welcome to everybody that's joining us online for the live stream as well. I'd like to start by thanking every single participant, institution and private provider that took part. Without the engagement of so many colleagues across the sector, this report would not be possible. We're also delighted to report that this year the survey includes data for 473,000 bed spaces, which we estimate is about 70% of the sector, so a good representative sample. This is the largest data set we've ever received for the accommodation cost survey during what is an incredibly busy, stressful time for accommodation providers. So we really appreciate those who prioritise taking part at a very stressful time, particularly this year. We give you our sincere thanks. The collective sharing of information is essential across the PBSA sector. And whilst all the data is confidential and anonymised, this type of collective insight continues to professionalise and enhance this ever-growing sector. It helps to identify where the sector is heading and give pause to consider if change might be needed. During the research, the project team have regularly talked of supporters of the survey as being part of a club, doing their bit to enhance the sector and ultimately recognising our role in working together to enhance the experience for our residents, students. So thank you all, and you will see from this first slide the improved response rate, but most significantly, the growing dominance of the market by the private sector. Gradually, private providers have grown their market share, but this survey reveals the full extent of that as they become the weather makers in the world of student accommodation. This report considers what that might mean for the future.
So as you all know, the survey now covers much more than costs, but we thought the appropriate place to start the accommodation cost survey was with the headlines around costs. So it's useful to point out at this stage, there's a kind of a large section in the survey about how we calculate the costs and how things have worked, but we ensure that things are easily comparable, so strip out some of the additional information and make sure that things are comparable. So we present a lot of data this morning on annualised rents, which is, I suppose, more of a truer cost to student, but there are also some snippets of weekly rent within this presentation and within the main report that you'll be able to see online from now. So, of course, it's no surprise that rents are going up. Things in the sector are getting more expensive. And importantly, these increases have continually marched on ahead of inflation. Quality at the same time generally continues to rise. But of course, that comes at a cost. So we'll analyse kind of what that means to give you the early headlines at this stage. So the average annual rent of a room in PBSA, which is the top right-hand side of this slide in the UK, is £7,374 on an annualised basis. And that represents an increase of 4.4% on last year and 16% more than in the last survey back in 2018-19. Since 11-12, so 10 years ago, rents have risen 61%, which equates to 4.9% year-on-year average. So within institutions' own accommodation, the annual rent on the right-hand side there is 6,227, and that is dwarfed by private providers at £7,732. But a further layer of detail and significance here is that the private rooms, when they're incorporated into an institution's portfolio, are actually £7,059 per year. So the difference between a university's own stock and then where the university is buying it in from a private provider is quite significant. And then that leaves behind directly let private provider rooms at £8,002, which is where the private provider average then comes in at 732 down at the bottom there. But that additional layer sort of breaking out that relationship is of interest. And as you saw from the response rate that Victoria just mentioned, the difference or the sort of growing or continued growth of the private sector does mean that that's becoming more and more prominent and more stark in terms of the cost differential. Rents in rooms provided by private providers, 24.2% more expensive in this year, 21-22, compared to 21.4% for the 2021 academic year. So the gap in cash terms has increased and now stands at just over £1,500. Looking towards a weekly basis, which is the next slide here. The overall room type weekly rent across the sector is £166 a week. And looking at the room types in a bit more detail, the average rent for an ensuite stands at 162 in university accommodation, but interestingly 155 in a private provider direct let, which is a only example really of private providers having rooms at a lower rate than the institution. But remember, the universities also have a slightly more available stock of a kind of standard self-catered room, albeit that that's starting to disappear, which we'll touch on later. But the average rent in the university standard room is 132, at a lower sort of entry point into the survey. Studio is unsurprisingly the most expensive room type, £214 in universities and £228 amongst private providers. And clearly, regional variations and variations throughout the home nations are significant. So we'll come on to that in a bit more detail. But we wanted to lead off with the headline cost findings. We'll now go on to a bit more detail in terms of key findings throughout the survey and return to some costs in a bit more detail and what that means also in the context of student finance and loans.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of the key findings that are covered in the executive summary that you've all got. So, firstly, we see that rental increases in student accommodation have continued to rise ahead of the general rate of inflation and much faster than the rest of the private rented sector as well, which has inevitably shrunk student incomes. 2021 is actually the first time in recent memory that inflation has outpaced annual rental growth, but unfortunately that's because of general living costs and not because things are getting more kind of inexpensive. Another key finding was that we're seeing universities holding less influence over the market and generally being a bit less engaged in where students live. There is some indication that universities are losing their manoeuvrability in setting rents, with rent escalators being built into agreements, or in some locations, private providers exclusively setting rents in the market, where universities have no or very limited stock of their own. The survey revealed that private operators primarily set their rents based on what their competitors are charging, a practice which effectively loosens rent levels from the indices of inflation and student budgets. Unsurprisingly, we continue to see the dominance of ensuite bedrooms in the makeup of the market, but it's important to recall that these are traditionally private provider owned and newer. So while standards are improving, this is coming at a cost to the consumer. Related to that, we are seeing the disappearance of affordable accommodation in many locations. This will continue as university stock that's a bit older continues to fall out of commission. So a recent Cushman and Wakefield report said that 200,000 units are a bit older and currently held by universities and are likely to leave the market in coming years, further reducing the availability of some affordable stock. Unfortunately, we saw one of the key outcomes, one of the kind of unfortunate elements of this survey was that a number of universities declined to participate in the survey, meaning there were about 70,000 university beds that did not feature this time round that were in it last time, which we think is really unfortunate. Rent levels are becoming more detached from the financial support available to students through government loans. That's a clear finding from the survey. We're going to go deeper into that a bit later, and I know our speakers will also be interested in this point. The current level of bursaries and similar types of financial support provided by universities and by some private providers is too low to be effective in helping making student accommodation affordable for the many students that may need it. The survey does, however, note that particularly some larger providers are seeking to innovate in this area and looking at affordability problems in earnest, and also looking at more diverse business models. And our recommendations later will address some of these points in a bit more detail. So Scott's now going to take you through some of the key points from the survey in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Victoria. So turning back to costs, as I say, we can tell you the average rent is 7,374, but what does that really mean? And it's it's a big number, it sounds expensive, but what does that mean in terms of how much money students have, where their income's coming from, and what impact does that have on higher education access and higher education funding? So going to university, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the people in this room today, it should be about individuals going to the place that best suits them, having choice, and making the right decision for their sort of life opportunity that they've been given. At the present rate, we're seeing many students simply being unable to study in certain locations or having no choice but to commute. And there's becoming almost a non-existent link between student finance and the cost of accommodation. So if we start with that by looking at some of the regional variations, Northern Ireland is the cheapest place for a student to rent a room. And you can see the grey there, that makes up rooms that are under £5,000, so a significant amount of the market in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, the cheapest place, followed by Wales, then Scotland and England at 6,471. You can see the rents at the bottom here, private providers significantly outstripping the universities. And quite interesting is that the Northern Ireland entry point on a private provider is almost £2,000, just over £2,000 actually, more than the university room. The sample in Northern Ireland obviously slightly smaller, but still statistically valid for the size of that market. And breaking that into the sort of weekly with more regions, and this slide is in the full report, so you can have a look at that and see where your region lies and what's happening with university owned and managed and the direct let private provider market. Looking specifically at London, it's 62% more expensive compared to elsewhere in the UK. The average cost of a room in London comes in at 10,857 compared to 6,707 in the rest of the UK. And the average cost of an ensuite self-catered room in London is 9,878, and the reference there being obviously that's more prominent in a UK undergrad or an undergraduate student coming into London. So that's the type of cost they can be looking at compared to that 6,451 in the rest of the UK. So almost 3,500 more expensive. Studios obviously driving some of the average rents in London higher, much more prevalent in London. And the average rent of a studio in London is £15,422 compared to 9,534 in the rest of the UK. And then looking into the letting types in the capital, since 1213 we've seen the institutional offer. Quite interestingly, this, I don't know if that points, this to the left here, the institution increasing by 62%. And I think that reflects some of the stock changes that we've seen in London of the older institutional beds moving away out of the market and being replaced, whether it's through partnerships or whether it's through institutions looking for their own new spaces, new bed spaces. But that's actually risen the most dramatically on this slide here. Outside of London, the increases have been slightly smaller, but still representing a 38% increase on university stock and 56% on private providers. I'm aware there's quite a lot of data that some of it's on the screen and some of it is in the script, but all these charts are taken directly from the full report. So rest assured that you can kind of catch up on that if you need to later. So what does it all mean for a student in 2021 living in the UK, or a student thinking about entering PBSA for future years? Well, Victoria mentioned the relationship between cost of PBSA and inflation, but also the rented sector more generally. So the bottom line there, you can see the UK rented sector has gone along kind of just under 2%, more similarly kind of aligned to RPI, whereas the PBSA rent continues to outstrip. And we mentioned earlier some of the sort of techniques being used to set rents, particularly in the private sector, is more about what others are doing and looking at trends in the market and less tightly linked to how much it costs to run the accommodation, some of those other indices that we've seen elsewhere. But significantly is the proportion of the student loan that's being used to pay for accommodation and what that leaves a student to live with while studying at university. So I said there were lots of numbers, so bear with me and I'll go quite slowly here. But in England, the maximum maintenance loan, this is the maximum maintenance loan for students outside of London, is 9,488, and in London it's 12,382. Average rental figures that we stated previously, we see that without any parental support. Almost the best case scenario for a student in England is that they have £69.52 a week to live off. There is a recent House of Commons paper that we reference later suggests that the actual average that a student takes home in England or receives in financial support from the government is a lot less than the maximum at 9,500. It's actually more like 6,500. So the reality for students is that almost all their support is going on their rent, and then the next anything else that they want to spend money on, they need to be finding themselves. But say this is almost a best case scenario, as it were, of how much money that student would have. In London, the leftover amount is actually £38 a week for term time expenditure for a student. So it's important to point out as well, though, in terms of the sector, many students, particularly in London, will be less reliant on loans. Lots of wealthy international students, lots of postgraduates making up a significant part of the market. So the loan relationship only tells part of the picture, but it's kind of a stark illustration of the relationship that we have, and also of where the student loan system kind of comes from and how some of those numbers are reached. And I know that's something that will come up later in the panel in a bit more detail. It's clear students wishing to live away from home in PBSA face a difficult choice. So whether it's about where they want to study or feel best suited to them, or where they can afford, there's a lot of decisions or a lot of parts to that decision in terms of where a student could afford to go. Moving across to Scotland, and hopefully we've got some Scottish colleagues on the Zoom feed as well. But the funding model obviously slightly different. The maximum a student can obtain through loans and bursaries is £7,750, and we saw the weighted average for a room in Scotland at 6,853. So that's 88% of their funding. Leaves the Scottish students £22.42 a week for other costs. Importantly, at the other end of the scale, which is the lowest, the kind of minimum funding package that a student might hope to receive in Scotland, that takes up 144%, but the rent takes up 144% of their available loan. So before they've started, they need almost half of their rent from other sources based on our average figures. In Wales, there's a few different differences in the Welsh system, which most of you will be familiar with. But some elements of the funding package are given rather than loaned, subject to means testing, but the maximum available funding, which we based all these things from, is just over £10,000, at £10,350. Average rents at Wales at 6,168. So almost 60% of the student finance package getting used up. Actually leaves the student £104.55 per week. So Wales kind of leading the way, but again, I must stress these are based on the maximums, and there's obviously a number of reports out there as to what students really get, and I believe there's also a Save the Student and NUS report as well that's been referenced recently, which obviously has some slightly different numbers in it. And then Northern Ireland, where I mentioned rents being cheaper on paper, but the funding system in Northern Ireland leaves students with £29.30 a week as the maximum package for students is just under £6,500. So despite a couple of slides ago, Northern Ireland looking like a more affordable place to live, actually when you break it down to what that really means for students, it tells a very different story. I mentioned the House of Commons library report. It was published on the 1st of December, and the average loan that they reported, I believe, is for England, is £6,900. So as I say, that would account in the England example for almost the entirety of the average student's average rent. Looking then onto affordability strategies and what universities and some private providers are trying to do about some of these things to try and ensure they are accessible to as a wider sort of spectrum of people as possible. Well, most organisations do not have an affordability strategy, and those that do, it's predominantly institutions, which the keys come off there, but institutions are the darker shade of green. So, and the private providers obviously catching up slightly from 2018. What's interesting though is where we asked if this was made publicly available, 46% of private providers don't make their affordability strategy available, and do make theirs available. And again, a similar sort of story with universities where there's a lot of secret affordability strategies. I think there is a kind of story to sort of, or a question to ask really in terms of what is the affordability strategy, and therefore how accountable are our institutions and private providers to that if it's not published, and how well known is that information. So something coming through in the survey there. There are a lot of really good examples of rent ladders, and the challenge I think with rent ladders we're seeing in the data has been where things are tied to long-term arrangements, or where you have particularly sort of challenging kind of rent increases or high price points, maintaining that ladder throughout. Victoria mentioned universities losing some control around some of that, and that can kind of have more upward pressure than perhaps some universities would hope for, and are seeing that quite a challenge to maintain the rent ladder. But maintaining those range of price points continues, but is subject to a lot of significant underlying challenges. And I think the other important factor here, which again will come out later on, but is the upward pressure is set to continue. This survey was reported, the data was gathered just before the big sort of energy spike. So that was a kind of something we talked about as a project group after the data had been gathered. Build costs are significant, labour costs are going up, running costs are high, and then you add in utilities as well. So it's a challenging situation, hence the sort of interest in an event like today, I think. So there's some of the headlines in terms of what it means for students, what the numbers are. And then Victoria's going to talk now in more detail about the makeup of the sector and how that will also affect some of these things.
Well, thanks, Scott, for doing all the heavy lifting on the statistics and numbers there. That was a challenge. That was great. So now I'm going to have a look more at the makeup of the sector and a little bit about the quality of the relationships between the private sector and institutions. So here we're looking at the shifting balance of ownership in purpose-built accommodation, and we're referencing back to 2012. So this shift in the ownership is one of the major stories really in student accommodation in the last decade. Overall, there's been an expansion of 30% in the number of bed spaces across the period, but during that time, university ownership of that stock has halved, and privately owned bed spaces have grown by just over 150%. In 2012, institutions provided 61% of total provision, and the private sector just 39%. Fast forward to today, and universities account for less than a quarter, and the private sector for more than 3/4 of the stock within our survey. With this shift in ownership, next we're looking at who students are renting from. So there's a major increase in the number of students renting directly from a private provider. So that's outside of even a relationship with a university, and that's the top line on this graph. While university-owned rooms have fallen away, the volume of private sector bed spaces used by universities, so under some form of formal or informal arrangement, has substantially increased, and that reached a peak last year. However, this year, the number of those types of relationships has dropped by 9%. We speculate that that's a result of universities not wanting to extend underwrite arrangements, both short and longer term, perhaps as they revisit their commitments and take stock of demand following the pandemic and some of the shocks that caused in the student accommodation sector, and really as a result of the shift to hybrid learning and students studying more online. Looking at the rooms available, self-catered ensuite is the dominant room type, but there is significant change in this area as well. Ensuites now account for 59% of all the provision that's available, but the number of studios provided continues to rise steeply, and they're now 12% of the total stock, up from 4% in 2012. With such significant changes in who students rent from, the need for strong relationships between institutions and providers has never been so critical. And yet there remains a question about the quality of these relationships at the moment. The Unipol ANAC National Codes undertook some research in December 2020, so during the pandemic. And that showed that the pandemic really had little effect on the nature of relationships and communications between the private sector and universities. Where they were good before, they remain good. And where they'd been poor, even in the context of a pandemic, and you think the need for greater cooperation, sharing of information, the relationship remained poor. That persisted. Amazingly, the research that we did in 2020 showed that private providers housing 150,000 students said they had no relationship at all with the university. If we dig a little deeper into results from this survey, from the Accommodation Cost Survey, we discovered that when it came to rent refunds during the pandemic, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, 34% of institutions only told their private providers at the same time that students found out. So there was no prior coordination or communication about what was happening. 7% of providers found out after the announcement had been made to students. In 17% of cases, universities did not make any communication at all with private providers about the matter. So there's evidence that often there's not a great link between universities and the organisations housing their students. As well, only 41 of the 76 participating universities responded to the question about information sharing, which is a quite strong contrast to their general disclosure in the rest of the survey as well. So this does leave an open question about the state of communication, partnership and relationships between universities and the private providers now housing many of their first year and international students. Looking at some of the key points from the pandemic, we asked a few questions about this because obviously, and we thank everybody who tackled these extra questions. Accommodation providers made efforts to support their residents through the various lockdowns with mixed results. This graph illustrates the differing measures taken by institutions and private providers and shows that private providers did lag behind somewhat in terms of supporting students with things like food deliveries, isolation, and providing things like online social activities to kind of reduce isolation when students were effectively locked into their accommodation. I think of particular concern for us, something that we noted was the lack of additional support provided for students with disabilities by private providers, and that was a real concern. As the sector came under pressure to make rent rebates to students, universities were the first to give them and refunded students more readily than private providers. Students living in private accommodation were less likely to get a refund than their peers who lived in university accommodation, and where they did, it was for a smaller amount. That being said, the total amount refunded that we reported in the Accommodation Cost Survey was £385 million last year, so not an insignificant sum. Next, I'm going to look at student support generally, including some comments on students with disabilities. The experience of the pandemic has accelerated a trend that we commented on in the 2018 survey, that all providers have a much bigger role to play in supporting the health and well-being of students. The pandemic was a useful reminder of how student housing is very different from the rest of the private rented sector, where increased flexibility and refunds were comparatively rare during the pandemic. On the theme of student support, we continue to see institutions well ahead in supporting specific needs and the preferences of student residences. And all of the institutions that responded offered some form of specialist types of accommodation. Universities do recognise their special role in this regard, and they recognise that they're duty-bound and funded to provide for the needs of specialist student groups. But students with support needs are not well catered for in the private sector, although this is slowly improving. Last time we looked at this in 2018, 28% of private providers reported they had no specialist or alternative accommodation, and this is now down to 13%. So there is some progress, but there's more work that needs to be done. There is an important point here. If universities are moving away from their own provision, they need to ensure that the private sector caters properly for students with additional needs, and they need to work in closer partnership to make that happen. As public bodies, universities have a duty to consider how their policies or decisions affect people with protected characteristics under the Equality Act. However, one of the standout findings from the survey was an apparent backward step by universities here, with the number of rooms that are adapted or convertible for students with ambulatory disabilities falling since the last survey in 2018. As noted in 2018, institutions need to consider carefully how they can fulfil their enabling responsibilities under equality legislation and ensure there's an appropriate level of adapted and adaptable accommodation. Now, more than ever, there must be clarity around who does what. Is it the university or the private provider? The question we asked in the survey was, where does responsibility lie for supporting students with additional needs? The low base rate, 41 responses from universities and 32 from private providers, is worth noting and signals that there might be a degree of uncertainty about who is responsible for this area. From the perspective of the student, especially in a crisis or where an emergency where they need support, this is a major problem that does need resolving. But obviously it's perfectly possible to do, and we hope there'll be progress on this, and we'll certainly be working on this to try and support institutions and private providers to do that. We have seen research from many other sources detailing how student mental health has suffered during the pandemic. Both universities and private providers have upped their game in supporting students here. However, there does remain work to be done. 42% of university respondents reported that all staff who interacted with tenants had received mental health first aid training or something similar. But that was just 24% in the private sector, although it is improving. Recent changes to the Unipol and national codes for private provider is reflecting and driving greater training and support within the sector here. Other areas where private operators are reducing the gap and better providing for student needs are in the better recording of information about student support cases and increasing information available to students about NHS and GP services. But I think private providers need to step into the gap if in terms of pastoral support and wellbeing for students. This remains a really complex area for all concerned, and the focus must be retained so that the sector can better support student needs. We do note that there is evidence of excellent practice in some areas, and we really want to celebrate colleagues and organisations who are working diligently in these areas. So, thank you again. No?
Good recommendations. That's right. So we concluded the survey with a look at future challenges and actually asked respondents what you thought were the future challenges and what was coming out as far as you could sort of see, as much as anyone could see during the summer into the future. Affordability was raised by more than half of university respondents. Although it was important for private providers, oversupply was the most pressing concern raised by the private provider respondents. And that was also a pressing concern for the institutions as well. And so thank you for everyone who gave us some insight into that, because that's a kind of difficult summary at the end of a long survey. But turning to the recommendations, we've made recommendations in this report across three broad areas that I'm sure will be talked about more throughout this morning. But broadly in three categories: increasing sector unity, and Victoria's touched on some of that already, addressing affordability and how that might start to be looked at and achieved, and what the options potentially are, and some policy changes around student accommodation as a general kind of type of housing. So there are some, in terms of the sector unity, there are some excellent examples of working together around the country, but relationships between many private providers and institutions remains patchy, as evidenced in the report. There needs to be an increasing realisation that institutions and private providers rely on each other in slightly different ways, but go hand in glove to ensure a successful university town or city can operate where students want to be. So we're saying that universities should reach out to their private providers beyond their specific supply arrangements, acknowledge that there's a shared duty of care for all students, but also that this needs some clear boundaries. So some of the talk on the mental health challenges and who's responsible for certain things, in all cases, not just where there's a commercial arrangement, should be looked at and should be tackled, rather than sometimes I think these things come to a head when there is a crisis or is an important situation. So now more than ever, that's a really important part, particularly where we're seeing this trend that universities are housing fewer students themselves. So we say universities should be thinking of employing specialist staff who can make these meaningful links and really carry an influence and ensure that students are well supported wherever they may be living. The 2018 survey, turning to addressing affordability, we addressed the hope that more could be done to kind of curb the growth in costs. 3 years on, and as I said, the backdrop is challenging, and perhaps the more easier and effective solution is now to start looking at the student, how we can financially support the student. So some private providers are starting to bring in additional support, additional bursaries, and obviously universities have their own funding arrangements in place. But it's important to look at how we support lower income students and squeeze middle households, potentially where multiple children could be at university at the same time. It's important we recognise in that conversation that not all students receive the maximum loan amounts, or very few students actually, as the paper I mentioned demonstrates. And so the maximum loan amount is perhaps not a suitable metric when considering how much money a student actually has in their pocket. Additionally, students need good quality information in sort of year one and for future arrangements. So when they're thinking about where to go, they can make a proper choice free from marketing and promotional bias, but actually understand the real cost of going away and studying. And then turning to policy, I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't a traditional area. Victoria touched on the differences in terms of the pandemic response for providers of student accommodation against a traditional landlord and how that's totally different. And really, student accommodation, student housing is effectively tied to the institution that it supplies, again, regardless of supply arrangements. So there's potentially an opportunity here where sort of recent changes and recent activity that's gone on in government may be a good time for more cooperation between the DFE and the sort of newly formed Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing. And we think that's an important conversation to push forward, whether that's through the National Code or other avenues, to look at almost the legal status and how PBSA and how student accommodation more generally is kind of viewed and where the responsibilities lie, because it's not necessarily a straightforward landlord and tenant act with so many more responsibilities being actually picked up by the sector, not just being expected by students, but more can be done in that area to support and formalise some of that activity. So there are three areas of recommendations. As I say, they're the headlines of what we talk about. I said there's a lot of data within this kind of half an hour or so that we've just done, and lots more to read in the report. It's quite hard to do a kind of 100+ page document and four sort of months' work of data crunching in a short summary, but they're the headlines. So thank you for bearing with us. And back over to Victoria.
Okay, thanks very much, Scott. So thanks again to everybody that took part in the survey and contributed. Thank you to all of you for coming. I'm now going to invite Hilary, who's going to respond on behalf of NUS. And then after that, we're going to open up for a panel discussion and with some Q&A opportunity after that. So please have a think about if you've got any questions about the survey findings so that we can wrap up proceedings with a bit of healthy debate and discussion. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Hilary.
Good morning, all. I'm sure you can agree those were really impactful and shocking figures we've seen in the first accommodation cost survey since the pandemic began, and so there's lots to work through and lots to respond to. So first of all, thank you, Victoria and Scott, for taking us through these findings in detail and for all of yours and Unipol's work in producing yet another invaluable report on the state of play in the student housing sector. Also, I would also love to thank the Student Advisory Group, who I worked closely with to really shape the survey for this year to really speak to the issues that students were talking about. When we first started working on the survey 7 months ago, together with the amazing Student Advisory Group, it was students' treatment at the height of the pandemic that was at the forefront of our minds. The COVID outbreaks in PBSAs, the accommodation lockdowns, the securitization, the charging students £20 a day for food, and the poor access to welfare and support that students across the country were telling us they were experiencing last year. As the power of the accommodation cost survey is in its longitudinal nature, as students on the advisory group, we all wrestled with the value of focusing on the COVID response in this year's survey. Would it still be relevant months later? I think it was. What would this blip, as everybody was calling it then, really tell us about the trends in student housing? So it's less than fortunate coincidence that this launches on the very day that the pandemic has taken another turn, and students are yet again left wondering what will become the rest of the academic year. It can't be much worse than last year, but let me tell you, the bar is very low. I can only hope that this blip remains just that, and future advisory groups aren't having to ask about how providers responded in our next version in 2024. Since the last survey 3 years ago, we have seen average rents increase by over £1,000 or 16%, hugely outpacing inflation. That's an increase of 61% over the past decade. What's even interesting is, as I've been tweeting about the launch of the survey this morning, somebody tweeted that when they were at university just under 10 years ago, the average rent that they were paying was maybe just over £2,000 a year, and now we can see it's staggeringly over £7,000. So really stark figures that we're seeing in rent increases. As we've also heard, rent now accounting for 72% of an average loan in England gives students a mere £69 to live on. And in London, that's a paltry £38. And for any students here, for anyone that's listening or watching today, that contributes to maybe a small shop if you have a little close to you, maybe an even smaller shop if you have a Sainsbury's, an even smaller shop if there's only Waitrose's in your area, which I remember from university. Beyond England, though, students are struggling. In Northern Ireland, students are left with £29, and in Scotland, it's just £22 per week. Quite frankly, I'm ashamed that this is the state of play in a country that talks of a world-class UK higher education that expects students to live off of this. Of course, as we've heard, there are other trends which directly impact the student experience. Universities have vastly stepped away from housing provisions in their droves, and profit-driven private providers now dominate the market. Low-cost accommodation is being replaced by premium studios that are way beyond the budget or the maintenance loan of any student that I and we know. Universities have willingly abandoned their responsibility for the welfare of their own students and their role in the student housing market. Affordable housing goes truly to the heart of an affordable education, and I don't see institutions doing nearly enough in this respect. Where institutions do provide accommodation, there are clear benefits to students. They're exposed to fewer administrative fees and have access to support if they are struggling to make their rent. They can be sure that their provider has policies in place so that marginalised groups aren't excluded or disadvantaged. There are staff on site that can provide some level of well-being support. And the survey's findings related to the pandemic show a clear benefit for students in terms of the amount of refunds and rebates that universities provided, of course, after many rent strikes. But it is all too clear that universities have washed their hands of their responsibilities to ensure an educational experience that allows their students to thrive, instead laying fertile ground for a system that enables landlords to thrive. For while the number of students entering higher education has never been greater, neither has the cost of it. Record numbers at university, together with spiralling housing costs, have set us on a collision course. What could help at this point? More support for students from lower income households living in PBSAs, for sure. Bursaries, institutions working in partnership with private companies to ensure wraparound support for students, and strategies that ensure providers supply a higher proportion of genuinely affordable accommodation. And that's to say rent setting with your student unions, rent setting with local cooperatives, and making sure students can truly be a part of that process. But these are sticking plasters on a broken system. Essentially, education and the housing market are doing what markets classically do. They fail, and education is next. We have the student housing market propped up by public funding in the form of tuition and maintenance loans. This money is swallowed up with little to no regulation and inadequate investment in addressing the diverse needs of the student population. We spend around £30 billion per year on housing benefits, which just subsidises high rents and low wages. If we allow ourselves to think that bumping up maintenance loans is the answer, we're just creating the same situation in student housing. We must be bolder. So let me lift the mood. Because where I see darkness, I look a little further and I see light. Where I see market failure, I also see an opportunity. This system, this one that has failed us over and over, doesn't have to be this way. Purpose-built student accommodation is in prime position to be a model of social housing with universities, charities, local authorities, and cooperatives asserting dominance in provision, where students and student unions are fully involved across all governance, where any profits made are reinvested by the government back into building affordable PBSAs rather than lining the pockets of shareholders. This is the student housing of the future, the one that students across the country are reimagining and building themselves. So, when levelling up is an empty slogan and widening participation is just a buzzword, students know it. We see an education system as broken as the housing market, and we know it's time to start over. Thank you.
I would ask our panel members to come forward now, please.
Seconds. Can I just nick that from under there? Is that okay? Right. I'm just going to bung that there for a second. Okay. Well, thank you. I think we're all together. Panel session. So we've got some incredibly tight timings on this. Although I notice we're absolutely to time, which my chairing is certain to wreck, is what I really feel. So, and thank you, Paddy. There's nothing worse than being self-deprecating and then people agreeing. Okay, so we're going to start with Sarah Jones, who's a consultant and who's got quite a hand in this. Now a partner at Cushman & Wakefield's, but before that working at Empiric and oversaw the production of this report. And by the way, co-authored the Higher Education Policy Institution report that came out on student accommodation, The Facts, with me. But yeah, I wrote the title. So Sarah, your thoughts?
Well, thank you. And thank you to Victoria and to Scott as well for assimilating what is a huge amount of data, making it sound really fantastic, and well done for getting through that. And thank you, Hilary, as well, for your rundown from the NUS. So I don't really want to spend a great deal of time talking. The point about affordability is a huge one. And you know, put in the context of what we know that the government don't know about student living costs, I think this is a really important survey. You know, the last time the government did any work on the real living costs of students was in 2014, which is just too far long ago. And although work is underway at the moment, it is going to take a long time for it to come out. And in the meantime, I'm really hoping that this data is going to get to, is going to get under their noses. And the email I sent this morning was that Paul Bolton, who's the man at the House of Commons Library, who writes all of the reports in terms of student living costs and funding, we just need to go and stand outside his door now with this. I think the point about people working together is really a massive one as well. Universities and private providers have been shown in this report to be in contact, but not as much as they should be. And if you saw it as a Venn diagram of, the little peas in the pod, the accommodation that's provided by each individual type of organisation, and then the small part, but increasing, where people really are relying on each other. That relationship binds people, it binds them completely. And the level of communication, we kind of asked some questions in this survey that could be linked together about the quality of relationships. What was there and what wasn't said, what was said and what wasn't said. And I think it was incredibly telling, and I think, that's one of the bases for our recommendations, really. You almost need a kind of good cop, bad cop system. There might be contract managers in place to manage increasing relationships between the two parties, but you also need a good cop to say, hi, how are you today? How's it going? Let's talk about your students who are in crisis. Let's talk about people you haven't seen for a few days. Let's talk about what's coming up in our policy world, etc. So, working together, we are in this together, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm going to move on to Robin Walsh, who's joined us from being stuck on a train behind a fallen tree in the New Forest. So we're delighted to see you.
It's the wrong kind of tree.
And yes, you know where you are with the tree, though. At least it's got some presence, hasn't it?
Substantial.
Who's head of residential services at Bournemouth University, and also a prominent member of CUBO. Although we've got Joe Hardman, who chairs CUBO in the audience. And we reference Bournemouth a couple of times in the report as being a beacon of good practice. And I was just looking at Robin's CV here, and previously Urban Nest, and then Mansion Group, and the University of the Arts, and Unite. Well, so to be honest, Robin's got a good cross-section of the whole sector within his own CV. So it's at one level unsurprising that Bournemouth is a beacon of good practice and that Robin knows what he's talking about. So over to you, Robin. No pressure.
No pressure at all. Yeah. I don't know how I've ended up in this position, to say the truth. But it's been fun. It's been fun. Reading the report over the last week, it's been a real eye opener, and I've been sort of jotting stuff down. And I think there's so much that you could possibly talk about within the report, but I just kind of wanted to sort of pick out a few bits under the three areas of recommendation that really sort of ended up jumping out for me. So around sort of increasing sector unity, I'm going to throw out a few stats. But the private sector, looking at, the real big one, the real shocker was that 76% of PBSA beds are delivered by the private sector now, compared to, that's like over-flipped since 2012-13, which is just, it's not unbelievable, but it's such a big number.
Yeah.
And when the PBSA private PBSA providers were asked, were they looking at significant growth, 27% of them said that they were looking at significant growth in the future. So, you take that with the squeezed kind of off-street HMO market, it just demonstrates that the private sector is just going to be continuing to grow and deliver the majority of the bed spaces where the students are going to be living. But then looking at the university sector, you've got, looking at the numbers over the last 4 years, I would say that the university-owned beds are broadly stabilised. But again, going back to, the universities asked the same question, 32% of them did say that they were looking at modest growth in the future. So that says to me that, the universities are not out of the picture. They're still very much, involved in continuing to grow their portfolios, but at a much lower level to the private sector. But the big question is, when they say modest growth, does that mean owned beds or does that mean noms?
Deals,
yeah, deals. And, that's going to be interesting to see how that sort of goes, because looking at the numbers of the universities using private beds, had dropped a little bit since last year. So 96,000 beds in the latest year of the report, to the previous year 88. But if you look back at 17-18, it was 56,000. So actually, the universities have significantly increased their use of the private sector under nominations deals, and I think that's going to continue. And I think that, it's in the report, but I agree with it, is that, there's a much higher use of universities basically looking at their risk management and looking at their need, looking at sort of shorter term arrangements and using the private sector to their advantage. So in summary, I think how that sort of all connects back into the sector unity, increased DL growth, broadly stable university-owned beds and fluctuating nominations numbers. I think, agreeing with what's said in the report is that, the collaborative approach couldn't be needed more now to support the students. Because remember, this is not about beds, this is about students and about what the students need. And I think there's a real danger, and I see it in the sector, is that we end up working in parallel to each other, and we end up trying to replicate and duplicate the things that we're doing. And that's just not a good use of resource. It's not good for the students. It adds cost. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So big supporter of collaborative working. Affordability. Some really interesting stuff around affordability. Private providers, saying, in the report it says around private providers are sort of looking at doing stuff at affordability, yet when asked the question, only 27% of them say that it's a challenge for the future. Kind of that really shouts to me. It's that kind of, in the private sector, the danger is just taking that purely commercial approach of what students can pay rather than what they should be paying. So, a lot to be thinking about there, but that's always been the case, I think. The NUS model, broad brush, not really relevant to the whole student cohort. As we know, there were students, as mentioned, through the report and presentation earlier by Scott and Victoria, was that the student, they don't all get the grant. They don't also grant. I wish, right? They don't all get the loan. They don't all get the loan. And then you've got international students. You've got postgraduate students. So sort of an affordability strategy. 34% of universities saying they've got affordability strategies, but it's a little opaque. We don't know what those affordability strategies are. And I think there's a lot of work there to be done around what affordability means, what affordability strategies are. And that's a real opportunity, I think. Universities, in the report, talking about universities providing bursaries. That concerns me a little bit. It's one of the things that can be looked at. It's not a silver bullet. Universities, they've got pots of cash, which they choose to use as they see fit to run their institutions. And I think some universities will have better opportunities to look at increasing or creating accommodation bursaries. Other institutions will struggle, and the danger is that you'll be robbing Peter to pay Paul, just moving money around. And then maintenance loans, I think that moves into the policy change sector. I think picking up on what we're talking about, increasing maintenance loans. I think there definitely needs to be a review and there needs to be some transparency from government about how maintenance loans are calculated. But, dare I say it, bringing back some kind of form of grant, means-tested grants, I think it's got to be on the cards. And that's where I'm going to end.
Good point to end on, I think. Excellent, Robin. Thanks very much. Moving on to Jenny Shaw, who's got the horrendous title, actually, of Higher Education External Engagement Director for Unite. But I got that down to all-round good egg, really.
I'll take that.
And many of you will know that Jenny's got an enormously long track record on mental health and well-being within the sector, well before it hit the headlines. And is also a trustee of the Unite Foundation, which I think she'll touch upon, whose mission is to enable young people without parental and financial support to access and succeed in higher education. So a real expert in this area, but also representing the country's very largest provider of student accommodation. Jenny.
Thanks, Martin. I'm a bit nervous now because that was quite a build-up. I hope I can live up to it. I'm going to approach this from. I was thinking around all the things that have been raised in this report, and obviously this is the last 10 years of my life. So I want to approach it from the perspective of what is it we're actually selling, and how has that changed over the years. It was a great surprise to me to find out how old the accommodation cost survey is. It's even older than me.
It is,
so,
yeah.
and I'm quite old. It goes back to the 60s, and I thought that was quite a good starting point, because that's really, I think, where the student accommodation sector was born in the format that we know it now. And it was born because there was a real desire to have these living learning communities. It wasn't called that, but it was called something, I think, much more establishment. But this idea that you go away to university, you learn from your peers who are probably all quite like you, unfortunately. That's part of your education, that's part of your development for probably a professional role. And that was hugely invested in. And actually the student grants came largely as a result of the need to make that accessible to everyone. Of course, it was a much smaller percentage of the population, but that's where it started from. You go to the 90s, and it was a completely different ball game. It was about numbers, it was about bed spaces, and that was the phrase. That was the only thing I could find in anything from the government or from HEFCE, as it was then, about student accommodation in that sort of early to mid-90s. It's bed spaces, it's a commodity. We want to expand the sector, we need to expand it, we need the right number of beds. As long as they're of vaguely decent quality, it's a numbers game. And that's actually where the private PBSA sector was born. And when I first joined the sector 10 years ago, I said, look, guys, we're on a par with the people who supply the toilet rolls. We're a commodity, we're not a partner. And that's where it was then. And now we're in a completely different world again. We've got a new generation coming through. They want different things. They need different things. It's a much more diverse student body. And we've got to respond to those needs. We've got to respond to the mental health needs. Parents are more involved. They have higher expectations. We're moving towards a much higher service model of higher education. We're moving back to communities. We're moving back to it being, part of your education and a part of your development. And, of course, many universities have been doing this all the way through, but this is new to the private sector. But the private sector is trying to respond, and you can see that within the survey. But it is quite a high service model. So all of these things do have an upward pressure on the cost, and I think that's something to look at as well. I very much agreed with Hilary that we can only look at this at a national level when it comes to affordability. And I think that conversation, I don't know what that looks like, but I think there is that conversation to be had about how can we give students what they want and what they need at a price they can afford, and how is that going to be made to work? And I don't know what that answer is, but that's the only way we can tackle it. However, there is a lot of work to do on a local level as well, and I know Robin's mentioned this, and Bournemouth are a great example of this, but there are things that our accommodation providers are being called upon to do, which they are able to do, and there are things that they can only do in partnership with the university, and that goes across whether it's a direct let bed or whether it's a noms bed. So the quality of those relationships, unblurring the lines, those million little tiny things that you have to get right around mental health, around disability support, and all of those things are absolutely crucial. I don't know if I've got time for this. I did promise that I would say something. I promised Martin I would say something about the Unite Foundation, which is 10 years old as of pretty much now. 10 years ago, we did take a strategic decision to focus charitable giving, which is a share of our profits, into students who are at the most disadvantaged in the housing market, and that was care leavers and estranged students. And we've stuck to that, and we've built that and grown that throughout the years. But there is never enough to go round. So what we are starting to do there is have conversations with universities and other funding partners about, okay, how can we expand this model with maybe some different partners involved to make student accommodation accessible to those who are the most disadvantaged. within the student body. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you. Really appreciated. And then we've got a TV screen in the middle with the words Julie Rugg on it. So I'm hoping that Julie's going to spring into life any minute now. We're running slightly ahead of time, I think, but not much. Ah, Julie, well done. Okay, so you just deliberately let that tension build. I'll just introduce you. Sorry? I'll just introduce.
I let the tension build and then I popped up. Here I am.
Okay, right. So if I just introduce you and then over to you. I'd like to thank Julie Rugg, Dr. Julie Rugg for being with us today, albeit online. And she's Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Housing Policy at the University of York. I think that's still right. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. And a major influencer, and I know Julie will probably disagree with this, but you know, insofar as anyone has influence on housing policy, Julie's the major influencer of housing policy. She's currently sitting on the ministerial roundtable looking at the Renters Reform Bill, but many of us will remember her from the government-sponsored review of the private rented sector that the outgoing Labour government commissioned in 2009, which is a really seminal work, and it's still, frankly, as fresh as a daisy. But it was refreshed anyway, not paid for by the government, as I recall, in 2018. It's a nationwide foundation, I think, was it? Yes. I suppose when I was looking through Julie's CV, I just reminded myself, Julie, that your other big interest is cemeteries. So if anyone wants to know about the death of higher education, perhaps Julie's also an influencer. But Julie's going to approach this, I'm sure, from a really sectoral, private, you know, a bigger, wider viewpoint. So very interested to hear what you're going to say, Julie.
Right, thanks ever so much. And thanks for the opportunity to comment on the report, the latest, as we all know, in a series that continues to offer a really essential insight into a distinctive and important sector in the housing market. So as indicated, I'm a researcher with a focus on the private rented sector. And I really like thinking about the student housing market because I like to think about what it's telling us about the bigger trends. I tend to see student housing as a kind of a bellwether. It's part of the market where we've seen major large-scale investment, a long way ahead of the curve compared with the rest of the PRS. And so I wonder often, is the rest of the market going to follow what we see happening with student housing? But one element is certainly telling. The student housing market reflects what I would regard as the single most important characteristic of the PRS at the minute, and that is it's in a state of flux. The PRS is changing in character, and the most distinctive element of change sits with a shift in its supply side features. Overall, this change is seeing a substantial growth in the number of larger scale providers and a reduction in the number of smaller scale landlords. And in part, this is a reflection of the fact that those smaller scale landlords are tending to step away from the market. And I think there's one notable impact of this development, and that is a reduction in the availability of the more affordable rental options. And this particular trend, I think, plays out in the student housing market in a very distinctive way. There is and continues to be, as we've seen, a reduction in the willingness of higher education institutions to offer direct provision of student accommodation. We've seen a proliferation of larger scale private sector suppliers, but this has not necessarily led to the kind of competition which contains rental increases. So the report, as I'll remind you, as Scott mentioned earlier on today, the report indicates that private sector suppliers are much more likely to benchmark against each other. Around half of them indicated that this was their main determinant when it came to rent strategy. These suppliers are much less likely to link their rent increases with inflation. However, competition as it's framed in this particular market isn't about containing rental costs. It's largely around inflating property specification and amenity. For much of the private rented sector, rents tend to walk in step with wages, but the student housing market is different. Student income is rather more fluid. Student loans are augmented through parental contributions, and an influx of overseas students creates a lot of elasticity around what might be regarded as a desirable price point. Affordability, it sits at the very heart of this report. I agree it's hard to define it as a metric, but I don't think we should lose sight of it. Like the authors of the report, I'm dismayed, but not necessarily surprised, by the fact that so many private suppliers in the student housing market pay the issue of affordability very scant regard. Indeed, I want to remind us of the statistic of the proportion of private rented providers with an affordability strategy dropping to just 13%. And I think that's very telling. Overall, I think when it comes to the private rented sector, it's always a good idea to ask, what is the role of the private rented sector in the broader housing market? What's the function? This is a good question when it comes to student housing. What do we want the student housing market to deliver to us? What do we want it to look like? And this is where we should be heading. Traditionally, this market was distinctive because it was so highly responsive to need. It provided a good supply of budget options available for letting during term time. That's the basic student demand. The student housing product is now arguably defined by the supplier, who is perhaps less responsive than we might like. This report indicates that yes, there is a ladder of price points, but the bottom rungs of this ladder are disappearing and student contract terms are lengthening. Higher education institutions are withdrawing from the housing market. And I think with that, we're losing any sense of the principle that students, as a group of young people, need our care and protection, not least protection from financial exploitation. So I was feeling pretty depressed, to be honest, having read this report, but then I cheered up because I listened to Hilary, and I really endorse Hilary's vision for the future of this market. The student housing market's really distinctive because it has a single rental tenant body that has the capacity to reframe how it engages with the market, because its unity brings it a great deal of strength. So I'm thinking that maybe one thing that we can look forward to in the future, if we can look forward to anything, it's seeing the emergence of a strategy that might drive Hilary's vision forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie. And as we expected, a fairly big picture view. So thank you very much for that. Okay, and we'll move on to Nick Hillman, who is Director of Higher Education Policy Institute, HEPI. Been there since 2014. I think they've must have brought out a report pretty much on a weekly basis since then. Worked for David Willits, now Lord Willits, Minister for Universities and Science from 2007 to 13. And I was really cheered up, actually. I didn't know you used to be a history teacher, so you know, I kind of reminded myself about the values of history. A bit unfashionable at the moment, I think, but you know, what a surprise that that's your base. So I'm very interested to hear what Nick's got to say, and with a real eye on and finger on the pulse of public policy. So over to you, Nick.
Yeah, well, thank you, Martin, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak at this event. And of course, history is a good point to start, isn't it? Because this survey is such a longitudinal survey in a sense. It's been going for so many years that I think that is very largely where its value lies, because you can do proper time series comparisons, just as, for example, with our own student academic experience survey that we've not been running as long as this survey, but we have been running for a good 15 years or so. And although we're a think tank that ranges over the whole of higher education issues, we have produced quite a lot of our own work in this space, including what I think is a fascinating paper by an architectural historian at the University of Oxford called William White. He wrote Red Brick Book, and he looks at the history of student accommodation in the UK, even going back beyond the foundation of this survey, and how it's changed, what its purpose is, whether, to a certain degree, it's sometimes lacking a purpose sometimes in the modern world. And we've also published, you mentioned it again, Martin, when you were introducing Sarah, a compendium of facts and figures about the current state of the student accommodation sector by Sarah and by Martin, which I'd also draw your attention to. And we've also written about the other group of students who, of course, are not really a focus today, but are incredibly important commuter students, because their accommodation, it's not really on the agenda for today, but they live somewhere, and where they live has an impact on their study, and very often they lack quiet study spaces, they have transport problems, and I think it's important to flag them as well at the beginning of this. Now, obviously, I've only got 5 minutes. It's a 100-page report. Lots of other people have already spoken, and I was worried that all the good points would have been taken, as to a certain degree they have. So I just want to raise 3 points that relate to the report, but are also, they're a bit more tangential than maybe some of the other things we've heard. And the first thing I want to say is, I think we need a new term for PBSA. I think PBSA is a really unhelpful term, partly because it's an acronym that people outside this room don't always understand, but mainly because it's lumping together two things that are very different, as the data we've seen this morning shows. University-built and owned PBSA is cheaper and it's different, and providing more services to those disabled students and things like that we've heard about, than private sector PBSA. And we're lumping them all together. And I know in your survey, of course, you do your best to distinguish the two. But this term PBSA is unhelpful, I think, when we as a student accommodation community are trying to explain the issues to the outside world. And I know there's lots of grey areas in between fully owned by universities and fully run direct lets, et cetera, by the private sector. But I actually think if we got some sort of new term for PBSA to describe those two different things, it would also shine a better spotlight in those grey areas in between, rather than rolling it all up and pretending it's all PBSA. And I think it would give us a better sense. It's like sort of saying, well, winter and summer, they're both types of weather, so let's just put them together. Cold water and hot water, they're both types of water. Let's just treat them, treat them the same. Tory and Labour, they're all politicians. We treat them all the same. And so I think it's a bit unhelpful. So that's the first point. The second point, of course, is, one thing that's very, very impressive about, I can't say PBSA now that I've said it's a bad term, about the provision that we're talking about this morning, is, of course, its sensitivity to demand. I accept a lot of things Hilary said, but nonetheless, it is sensitive to demand. And I spent earlier this week time at the Property Week student accommodation conference, where some of you will have been, and it was almost as if COVID hadn't happened. The appetite in the room to go on building new stuff, to go on delivering more bed space in cities that are underserved, to go on tapping into that demand that exists. And the accommodation providers always tell me, of course, that one of the challenges here, and you flag it in your report, is that the more expensive beds go quicker than the cheaper beds very often. And I think this links, one of the challenges that was sort of flagged up in the conversation a moment ago. And that is a really big challenge, because we all care about affordability, we all care about how much spare money students have to spend on all the other things they need money for, and yet the more expensive beds are going more quickly. And it does lead me to think, as the sector is going to continue growing, our forecast, just England, just full-time, just young students, is for 358,000 more students by 2035, predominantly in the southeast and London. Huge wave of demand coming our way. I do wonder why, or whether there's space for a good quality, low cost provider who could clean up actually in this space. And I wonder if, when you do this survey in future years, we will see more innovation at that end of the market. And I don't know, as I say, demand doesn't necessarily suggest that will happen, but equally, we had a dinner last night with Claire Marchant from UCAS. She said there'll be 1 million people applying to university by 2025 each year. They're not all going to be people who can afford the sort of rents that we've heard about this morning. Just on that, I just wanted to touch on one other point, but sort of segregation, diversificate. Let's keep segregation. I know people want to live with other people like them. And I know a lively market in student accommodation is going to have lots of different price points. And broadly, that's probably a good thing. I'm sitting to the right of Hilary, and that's probably no accident given our politics. But I also think universities should be melting pots. You should have the person in the room next to you who comes from a totally different background to you, a different culture maybe, a different country maybe, or at least a different part of the UK. And the more complex the student accommodation market becomes, of course, the less likely that is to happen. And I'd quite like to hear, actually, Hilary's thoughts on that. Because, I like the student accommodation being responsive to demand, but I also worry that university might become less of a melting pot, even though, as the total student body diversifies. And then the final point I wanted to make is, and I actually, there's the one thing I think probably the only thing I disagree with in the report, is one of your policy conclusions is that people need more information. If they have more information, then maybe they'd make different choices. There's a hint there that some students are making suboptimal choices, and maybe a supply would be different if demand was shaped differently by the information as well. I don't actually think it is more information that people need. You know, when it's career, when you're in a careers world, they talk about information. They say that's not actually that useful. What people need is advice and guidance. You know, in the careers world, people talk about IAG, information, advice, and guidance. And when I talk to sixth formers and teachers and careers advisors, I don't think it is more information they need. There's actually quite a lot of information out there if you look hard enough. You know, I was chatting to Paul Humphreys of Student Crowd the other day, for example. You know, Unite produces lots of their own information. There's a lot of information out there. I think the lack, and shoot me down in flames if you disagree, is the more personalised advice and guidance element. So, you know, people need to think more deeply than they do. Do you actually want ensuite? You know, what's the trade-off there? You know, you're paying more. It's not. You don't have an ensuite at home. Why the hell do you want one in term time? Some people will want. Some people say, well, I still want it. You know, the trade-off between a larger bedroom versus larger social spaces in your accommodation. The trade-off between the transport, distance to travel to your campus. How much money you're going to have left for your social life at the end. And I would like to see somehow, and it would cost some money, of course, people given more advice and guidance, not just more information at the point of application about their student accommodation. Because, my final sentence, because I think when we all look back on our time at university, our accommodation choices shaped our time there at least as much, very often, as the course you chose. So for many young people, it's the second most important decision they will ever have made in their life after what course they chose to go on at university. And so it's so important that we help them make the right decision. Thank you.
And it's an interesting point. I'm not sure I could tell you anything about what I learnt in my first year as a history student, but I could draw you a plan of the room that I lived in. And of course, I'm still in touch with some of those people who I met in that year. So, yeah, it's a particular moment, isn't it? In the development of kind of a progression and transition to adulthood. I've got my notes on a computer here. I was quite recently at a concert where a world-leading pianist had their music on an iPad, and in the middle of playing, their iPad went down. It was vaguely reassuring that they needed the music, actually, to be honest. But I have some trepidation that if this disappears, it really goes forever in this room at the moment. It's difficult being the last speaker, and I don't want to go over really what's already been said, but I think we've had a really good span of comments, and it was very, very interesting to see Julie Rugg kind of go for the Hillary option, as it were, yeah, well, there you go. And it's just worth noting that in the room, you know, we've got Alan Hilton, who runs a not-for-profit organisation, and we've got Goodenough College, which is a foundation, and we've got Unipol. So there are kind of, but we are minnows. Let's be clear about that. You know, we are minnows in the sector, and it's tough going for us all. And it has been particularly, but you know, there are other options, and there are several student housing cooperatives which are struggling for space. And it would be useful if they got a bit more support from the overall cooperative movement. The big finding for me was exactly what Robin said, really, which was the very significant shift to the private sector, and it's been coming over the hill for the last decade. You know, I don't know why I'm in any way surprised about it, really. I suppose I'm thinking about Monty Python thing, where people are kind of running towards you, but they're always slightly too far back. But then suddenly they arrive. I think that's the impression I have. And I think, you know, the ratio 75 to 25, and the private sector will continue to grow. We already know that there's 30,000 bed spaces a year in the pipeline for at least the next 3 years. And educational institutions are investing in accommodation, but effectively they're standing at net zero. They're replacing stock. And even there, some of that replacing of stock will be in partnership. And I think the traditional view, when we talk to politicians, it's kind of the hardest thing to break through, that when I was at university, I kind of get in now by saying, in many cases, let me guess, there was no internet, and Wi-Fi wasn't invented, and you know, because things have changed a bit since then, frankly. But the traditional catered hall, which, if you're not careful, looms into some politician's mind, is pretty much over. And the vast majority of students live in ensuite, self-catered cluster flats in this sector. That's the reality. And it's interesting, actually, because I wrote this yesterday, and I said, can we please stop using the word digs? And I noticed it's in the Daily Telegraph today, actually. So when I went to university in 1850, the word digs was just about leaving the scene. It's really vital that those providing this accommodation, and Julie raised it, what's it for? What's student accommodation for? Acknowledge the special nature of student accommodation as being integrally linked to the educational process. This is not the normal private rented sector. You know, housing benefits, tax credits, security of tenure, they're not really in the forefront of student housing. What's important is having a good place to study and learn. And the importance of accommodation to study and learn is become more important. I mean, not only during the pandemic, when it was the only place that you could study and learn unless you went home, but that's going to continue. You know, we are seeing more online lecture streaming. That is not going to go backwards, and therefore student accommodation really has to be good enough to enable you to study properly. In this first term, many campuses are reporting footfall of only being around 30% of pre-pandemic levels. So students are spending longer in their houses and flats, and that has to fulfil the role of both socialising and learning. And I think educational institutions now fall into two categories. Some larger universities are continuing to play a large part in direct provision of accommodation. They're building, they're entering into partnerships, and they're influencing their local markets for the better. But the vast majority of universities are becoming less involved in accommodation provision. It's just factual. And they're entering into fewer partnerships, and we see that. I think that will be a trend that will continue. What they're really doing is private sector direct lets are increasing, and you could see that in the figures. In 2021, we saw 112,000 beds owned by universities, and they used 88,000 for the private sector. But direct let beds, 273,000. So a lot of people are just renting off the web. Not only are nomination arrangements declining, but they're getting shorter. So in fact, the numbers don't reveal quite the shift that's going on. If the private sector is going to take the lion's share of meeting PBSA accommodation needs, I think you're right about the term, by the way. Although I think PBSA stacks up quite well in terms of D-look, I have to say. It's vital that universities and providers have close relationships to ensure well-being, welfare, mental health, and to ensure an adequate supply of special needs accommodation. And there are really good examples of good practice. Liverpool, Bournemouth, we feature, highlighted in the report. But there are lots of areas of poor practice. And some of us wouldn't mind having a list of those in the report, but, you know, we never get past the editorial stage. So it is essential that if universities rely on the private sector, that they retain their expertise in this area. And we have seen, you know, universities which have very little human resource capability. They kind of said goodbye to their accommodation a few years ago. Staff who knew how to allocate and knew what was going on in the sector have left. And if you're not careful, you get attempted dialogue stilted by inexperience, lack of knowledge, and frankly, in some cases, just uninformed arrogance. There were certainly providers who got told, you know, ridiculous things over COVID. You know, we want a full health and safety plan by tomorrow morning. You know, just kind of daft, really. But this is a two-way street. As the private sector takes on more students, they must take on greater responsibilities not normally associated with the typical landlord-tenant relationship. And they have a role in supporting students, encouraging communality and friendship, stepping in to recognise loneliness and mental health issues. And again, the best are already doing that, but others definitely need to follow. Probably about half are already doing it. Just on affordability, there's much made in the report about affordability. I don't think affordability does consist in working to a formula. And I think someone mentioned it's very difficult to get a matrix on that. And how could it, with such significant regional variations? A high-cost room in Bradford would be highly affordable in the southeast. affordability is about maintaining educational access and ensuring that the less well-off students, or even those who want to spend their limited resources on other things, can rent something decent within their price range. And we've mentioned as old halls are demolished and replaced by upmarket accommodation, that's disappearing and efforts must be made to replace it. We've concluded in this report that in order to have a meaningful impact on educational equality, that it makes sense to offer accommodation bursaries. This is a sticking plaster, but you know, hey, sticking plasters are quite useful from time to time. But we do need to have that wider debate and that longer term initiative, and we need to concentrate, but we are here suggesting we concentrate for the time being on the student rather than the building. A low-cost building can result in ghettoisation, and has done in some cases, and often the first-come students will snap up bargains. In some cases, those who want the lowest rents are condemned to always occupy the type of building that's soon to be demolished. And you can see that at a few universities. We have called for all accommodation suppliers to work with institutions to provide some bursaries, a really tall order for many suppliers, including I'm out for Unipol, since I don't think we're going to be able to recommend it and not do it ourselves. But we have to move towards this if students from disadvantaged backgrounds are to have the same student experience as the better off. And we have to do that not in some 19th century philanthropic action, but as part of countering the inequalities that must be tackled within higher education. Of course, a better solution would be for the government to overhaul the student maintenance system so that it accurately reflects costs, and it would be good if student support was based on actual living costs, really rather than the figure plucked out of the air by an anonymous person in the Treasury. At present, I would just say there's much of what I would call affordability washing, like greenwashing, with suppliers and education institutions listing off their aspirations, free of any practical implications. I've been in meetings with universities saying, oh, we like small buildings with bigger communal spaces, and larger kitchens, and big rooms, and lower rents. Easily said by a university that developed nothing in the last 20 years. There's also those who call for greater regulation without having a slightest idea of what that means or how it would be implemented. It really amounts to, I do not like what is happening and something must be done. I think that's coming from the southwest, I think, some of that. This affordability washing, or frankly, blah, 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 to coin a phrase at the moment, must stop and must be replaced by a real effort to put some meat on the bone. And I think we've had some idea of where to start today. Finally, I just wanted to end on a positive note, because as Julie said, I felt quite depressed when I read this. Within the purpose-built student accommodation sector, standards are high, and gone are the, at best, variable housing standards of the off-street local landlord. I know many think as building age that standards will fall, but there's no evidence of that at the moment. The growth of PBSA has enabled many local authorities to protect their local housing stock from disastrous conversions that cause so much community friction and such poor housing standards the last time universities expanded in the 90s. And PBSA has also enabled some housing stock to be freed up to owner-occupiers, families and professional renters. And the concept of student PBSA is pushing out into the new co-living developments that are taking place, where the best of shared student living is being applied to those young professionals entering the first phase of their career. And finally, I just wanted, before we wrap up, to thank all those who have taken an active part in the project. They're all in the acknowledgements, and it's a really long acknowledgements page, actually. And everybody on that list has done something, and normally something important. But just before we go, I just want to thank Sarah, Martin Rushall, who's not here, who did all the editing, Scott Blakeway, who heard do the presentation, but has kept the show on the road, and Jess, who was one of our trustees a couple of years ago, 2 years sabbatical, but now well behind her, who has been our key contact for this. and for surviving the stress of the last few days, because there is a certain rank up. And I should thank my trustees, a couple of whom are in the audience today, for agreeing to meet the not insubstantial costs of this exercise. And it's good that we've managed to keep it going. And Mel Research and Steve Handley, who did all the data stuff, without which there would be no report. And we'd like to thank Hilary and her staff, and particularly Natasha Duma at the NUS, and Rory, who may be watching us with COVID online last year in helping to map out the framework. And we're really delighted to have continued what I think is an important partnership we have with NUS. And the advantage of that partnership is it keeps us focused on the point of it all, which is the students. This report, I think, is comprehensive, it is accurate, it compares long-running data sets, it allows you to disagree with the conclusions because you've got the facts, it tells us where we are, and it should inform future developments. And with that, over to you. So we got some stuff online.
Okay. Yeah, we've already had a couple of questions online. So if we take, we'll take the first one because it links quite nicely actually with what people have just been saying. Martin, if I read them out, perhaps you can direct them to relevant people on the panel. And then we'll do these two and then we'll come to the room. So if you've got any questions, let us know. There's a couple of mics around and we have about 15 minutes for questions, so we'll crack on. The first one is, how do we increase the availability of budget rooms when the demand is for premium ensuite rooms?
Okay. You're going to do that, Sarah?
I can start. I think Jenny might help as well.
Sarah and Jenny.
Just, it's an interesting one. I feel like the way that PBSA is going and the data that people base the decisions for, what demand looks like, leads in that direction. And we purposefully asked the question, what sells out first? And you see actually quite a big proportion of people saying it is the most expensive stuff. I do feel like that is driven out of the fear of the unknown, oh my goodness, I'm sending my child away. Who are they going to be sharing with? And surely I'm not going to know what their bathroom looks like, so why don't you have that bathroom? That'll be great. But 2 weeks later, everybody would have made a different choice. And the amount of times I hear from universities, we've got people who want to move, there's people who want to downgrade, lots of nodding going on in the audience, because people, the realities of having to live on that budget and what that really means on a day-to-day basis just isn't there at the forefront. And I feel like there's a lot of hidden stuff, and back to the information, advice and guidance. And I also feel that there's a lot of hidden people who just go, look, those headline rates are not in my bailiwick. I cannot do anything about it. Therefore, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go into that situation. And trying to appeal within this big, system of PBSA where we've got these headline rates on everyone's website, some of those numbers are kind of detrimental to access to people who haven't got money for these types of expenditures. And so, we're creating a system that isn't accessible. It's really hard to fix, but the data isn't helping.
I'm not sure I can add a great deal to this. This is a fairly well-worn debate. I think the only thing I would say, and it's this more as a parent, I suppose, rather than a PBSA operator, but I've heard a lot over the years about, students should choose non-ensuite and they just need persuasion. And I think there in some cases that's right, but there is a high level of anxiety within this cohort, and that can manifest itself in concerns about cleanliness. And there are a higher number of neurodivergent students now, which is means that the sector is more diverse. But again, that does manifest itself in certain needs around private space and being able to sort of do your own thing. So I think we've got to temper those conversations with that understanding as well.
Quite a bit of research out there to show about 20% of students want really quite low-cost accommodation. And, by the way, there's research out there showing that 20-30% of students don't mind paying a lot for it. But that isn't a reason for not having any low-cost accommodation. And I was going to come to Robin. I think there are some institutions who suddenly see that lower band disappear. And when it has disappeared, that becomes very problematic. There are universities around the country that built all their accommodation at a given moment in the kind of 2004-05 period, and have pretty much a unitary rent structure. So this is the rent. I can't afford it. Well, we haven't got anything else. So I think, but I mean, you must be on the receiving end of this, Robin.
Yeah, I mean, we've got very little kind of lower end, you know, we're kind of clinging onto it. It's the classic, yeah, definitely, you know, we need to do something with it, and we're looking into doing something with it. You know, we want to retain it. But how do you do that without ramping up the rents? That's the big problem, isn't it? But yeah, you know, I think about Nick's kind of point around sort of advice and information, and it goes back to kind of like working together as well, because actually a lot of the initial conversations, the initial kind of platforms these universities, these prospective students engage with are universities, and that's where universities need to kind of step up and at open days and on their websites, you know, provide that information and have those conversations so students can then go away with the information they need to have a balanced choice. You know, because if you just look onto the private providers' websites, yeah, of course they want to sell their premium rooms first because that's the biggest risk. If they can get them out off the, you know, get them away, then you know.
Yeah, I think Paddy had was it a comment on that point, Paddy? No, there's a question. Go for it. Fire away, because.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple of comments first, though. Very quickly. Those of us who've been around far longer than we'd like to remember. Actually at times thought the P in PBSA stood for private, which I think if we went back to using that would make much better definition. And the other thing I'm slightly worried about is that nothing good has come of COVID, let's be honest, other than never has the profile of student accommodation been higher in university governance and university management. If we can't seize the moment now, with regard to some of these recommendations, I don't know when we ever will be able to. But a question on policy specifically here to Nick. Financial necessity often drives government policy, and the Vice-Chancellor on Wednesday stated, or his view, that given that tuition fees are static and maintenance loans increase with RPI, if not more, preferably, will the government be forced into a position of focusing on the maintenance loan as it becomes a higher percentage of the RAB which they're seeking to reduce?
Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very good question, and I was at the same conference as the one I referred to with you the other day, Paddy. And by the way, it's a very, very good conference, but there wasn't a single student on the platform at any point in the conference, and that is, I think, part of the answer both to the previous question and lots of the other things that have come up today. If you're not listening directly to the voices of students, you will miss some important things. In terms of affordability, I mean, again, Martin sort of put his finger on it by saying a Treasury civil servant ultimately will decide all this. I think we would have got announcements on student finance at the spending review if we hadn't had a brand new Secretary of State who was well within his rights, I think, to say to the Treasury, I need to get my feet under the table and understand the issues before you start reducing student loan repayment thresholds or things like that to get more money back in from recent graduates. There's just, but I'm not very optimistic, despite, even though, as you say, COVID has shone a spotlight on all of this, I'm not that optimistic because, a little bit, I mean, Sarah referred to this as well, you know, look at the lack of importance in government given to the Student Income and Expenditure Survey. The last Student Income and Expenditure Survey was, I think, for 2014, and it was for a period before all students were on, I'm only talking about England here, all students are on the 9K system. So it's a mix of pre and post, and it's all, the data's all over the shop. And they've spent ages getting a new one of those going and commissioning it, and it's not got off the ground yet properly. And that sort of shows, sadly, how little focus this gets. When maintenance, sorry, I'll stop here, but when maintenance gets a bump up, it's not because people have sat down and go, how much do students need to live? Let's work it all out. It's because, for political reasons. So when I was working for David Willits and we tripled tuition fees, it was decided to make it more palatable, make the Lib Dems more likely to support it. There'd be a bit of a boost in the maintenance package at that point. When George Osborne abolished maintenance grants to have a bigger loan package, again, to make that more palatable, they chucked a bit more money towards the loan, and some of your numbers here would be even higher proportion of the loan would be going on fees if that hadn't happened. So it's a second order issue in Whitehall, I'm afraid. That's the truth of it. The repayment phase is where the serious politics is currently. Young graduates trying to save for a property, paying childcare, etc., should they or should they not have a low repayment threshold to get more money back in?
Okay, well, talking to students, we've got Ruth Day in the audience here, so I just want to bring Ruth in. She's in the second year as Student Living Officer, great title, Student Living Officer at Bristol Student Union, and we did a case study. I'm going to come to you next, by the way. We did a case study in Bristol, which for the tone box reflects a certain gloom on what's going on in Bristol, where we've got a really major and persistent student housing shortage. So Ruth's working in incredibly difficult circumstances. Very interested to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, no, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult because we have, I guess, due to the marketisation of education, actually 2 universities in Bristol which are over-expanding, and to the point where we have students living in Bath, which is obviously quite a commute to Bristol, which is really difficult. And obviously, as a university, we're working quite close with the university, and we're signing an accommodation affordability strategy at the moment, which is really exciting. But we're doing rent setting right now, and I guess this is something that was highlighted in the presentation, is that we only have control over our owned beds. We have 0 control over the rent increases in our lease beds. That's just kind of built into the lease agreements, and it does sort of make you feel kind of very powerless, and like it's out of your control to like make students actually have an affordable place to live. So sort of given that, my question is, so how far, given these limitations and the power of the private sector, can institution affordability strategies go in solving the affordability issue? And then how do we as SUs, but also universities, tackle what ultimately is the bigger issue impacting affordability, which is private providers raising rents well above inflation, not offering any affordable beds in new builds, and then also building in large rent rises into those lease agreements?
Do you want to have a go, Hilary?
I mean, this mask first. Sorry. Oh, I sound louder than normal. I might defer this question onto some of you that are in the thick of it. I'm just a commenter and a criticizer occasionally, so take what you will. I first of all think that this goes back to the fact that it can't be dealt with locally. It can't be sort of this piecemeal process where you sort of wait for there to be a monopoly. Is that a monopoly? Not a monopoly, a domino effect, that's it. I don't know the difference between the games, clearly. But what's it called? Where there's this domino effect that somebody's going to do something really like cool and altruistic and be like, okay, we're going to make it affordable, and then expect everyone to do that. Because realistically, in first of all a marketized education system, and in the context of a society where largely housing is in crisis, it's not just in the student housing sector, housing is in crisis across the society we're living in. There has to be governmental action on this, and unless there's more work going on, like within the Renters Reform Bill, for example, and even things that we're seeing that are moving towards progressing in this area, like the London Plan, for example, then ultimately that change won't come, because there'll be more people that are just here to look for profit. And it's not an unusual thing to hear about people, especially people that are in the position to buy lots of property and then like rent it out, that they know students are easy prey. They know that ultimately you can lock a student into a contract a year in advance. You can basically get away with daylight robbery by locking students into contracts, treating them really badly and ignoring them with not many consequences, and then still get your rent check at the end of the day. And I think, unless governmental action is done, students are going to keep rent striking, and we're going to keep doing things until something happens. And universities are going to keep feeling that strain until they also stand up with the students that are fighting about it, right? And also push the government into acting on it. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying, Nick, about how there's a political part to this, right? And you know, I think there needs to be a shift in the discourse, especially for the government, who, you know, I'm constantly struggling with. But, you know, I think there needs to be a move for the government that they need to understand that this isn't sort of a political game like of is it Jenga? I don't know, chess? I don't know games. But this isn't sort of this political game of chess. This is lives, this is livelihoods, this is health. You know, mental health is directly impacted by accommodation. What you get at university and how you learn is directly impacted. And so if they don't treat that as centrally as they do as, you know, tuition fees and trying to reduce costs in lots of other areas, ultimately students are going to continue to suffer. But I don't know if any of you who are on the thick of it, that are doing all the processes whilst I'm tweeting at you and criticising bad practice, have anything to say for where universities might be positioned to act and push government in that area. That's a challenging question.
Well, let me just say, it's really difficult, Ruth. You know, a Unipol has to, we do developments ourselves, and we end up talking to developers. I think one of the problems with universities becoming a bit more disengaged from accommodation is that if you push the risk onto the private sector, they are simply pricing that risk in. And if the institution bears that risk, some of that risk itself, then things get a lot cheaper. I'm not quoting this as a big solution, but we've got Ian Robertson from the University of Leeds in the room, but we are building a 606-bed development, so bigger than we'd like, actually. But the reason for that is the whole building was designed around a price point. So we didn't want the rent. We started off by saying that's what the rent level should be, and then tried to meet it. It will be about £25 to £30 a week cheaper when it comes online, that building in 2023. So, you know, that's the difference. And the only reason that that difference exists is because the University of Leeds have basically underwritten it for a very long period of time. You know, it's a £200 million commitment to them. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to target that on a particular type of student. And if we'd have been looking over our shoulder and saying we might have to direct let this, then actually we just have to go to the lowest common denominator. So we can have shared flats for 8 because we've got the support for those larger units. If we're direct letting, well, perhaps shared flats for 6 and so on. Yeah.
Can I also just say that there's also a part of this where we need to recognise that, like, action on this goes further than just thinking about the challenges when it comes to moving the accommodation stuff, right? I think when you also think about, like, fundamentally, a lot of these really expensive accommodation blocks are being built to house international students who are assumed to have the money to be able to rent out a private studio that's en suite. Well, all studios are en suite because they're studios, but like, to have these sort of fancy accommodations because they can afford it, because they're rich enough to pay the tuition fees, so they'll be rich enough to get the accommodations, and that's just not true. And I think it's important that, you know, whilst we still have a system that, and, you know, I couldn't come here and not say this, but whilst we still have a system that continues to rely on international students to prop up a fundamentally broken funding system, then you're going to continue to try and market to these students that you're assuming can afford a certain level, so you're building more to attract them. But then when they get here and they're struggling, you're still carrying on with that system because ultimately it serves you in that sort of profit-driven mindset, as opposed to thinking about how do we make education accessible to all, like you were saying, Martin, and how do we do this in a way that doesn't just look at sort of the things that are popular to speak about, like tuition fees and like maintenance loans, but actually how do we make it about the whole educational experience, understanding that every part of it is inextricably linked. I wanted to use that word today because I've tried new vocabulary, but inextricably linked to one another and will affect students in every single way.
And I suppose finally, I'd just like to remind you that there are some universities that entered into very, very long-term partnerships with, you know, fixed inflator risers and took a lot of money up front. You know, sums of 50 and 55 million premiums were up front. And people did that, you know, until comparatively recently. And at the time, you know, a few of us were saying, hey, don't you think you're going to have to repay that? And of course, that money's now been spent, and those problems, those fixed inflators are still going. I think actually the staff in those universities affected are sitting there thinking, who on earth agreed to this? And I've seen no benefits from it because I only arrived 5 years ago. All I've seen is pain. I don't think that model will be resurrected, but we should be vigilant if anybody attempts to do so. Someone was wanting to ask a question at the back, yeah.
I don't actually need a mic very loud.
We just need it for our Zoom people.
Hey everyone, you're right. Just running back.
You are better with the mic, though.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So my name's Kellyanne Watson, ex-family member of Unipol, here from the Class Foundation. I work with a lot of private providers, and something, as you guys have all mentioned, they're finding it difficult how to implement a strategy into an affordable strategy into their buildings. So something that I would like to ask, and Sarah, this might be a really good one for you, is something that's particularly interesting, has been coming up time and time again. I was at Student Property Week as well, and it was mentioned, is that ESG is an extremely hot topic. The environmental aspect is a lot easier to measure and scale up, as is governance, but the social aspect of it is really, really difficult. And I'm wondering whether, instead of just talking about affordability being segregated on its own and being its own thing, whether we can implement it as a social value test and strategy, and that we can also look at the long-term benefits of integrating a affordable strategy into our structures and looking at the long-term effects of that. So if, for example, Catella is a great example of this. They're a European, really dominant in their CEE markets. Their occupancy levels are always at 100% because of the strategies that they've implemented through affordability and escalating that social value aspect. So that's kind of something that I would like to highlight, and whether that is the solution. And that's how we talk to private providers. It's about changing the tone, the language that we're using, and whether that could, from what Nick was saying, that's how we could kind of scale it and measure it. Yeah, that's me, sorry.
Cool. I'm really happy to answer that.
There'll be a large number of people in the audience, I think, who don't know what ESG is.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Do people know? Am I just being patronising?
It's always good to...
Probably about being patronising to half of you. Yeah.
So, environmental, social, and governance?
It's governance. Governance, yeah.
Thank you. Good.
Gobbledygook. I'm sorry, governance.
Pass the first test. That's good, yeah. I think you're so right to mention it, and it's actually linked to you. And I'm going to link it straight into money, actually, because social these days is the next bit in the kind of shareholder value chain, which is coming down the track. And when you hear, I mean, there's so many things that people would like to do out of the goodness of their hearts, but the market is against them. But now all the money is following social and environmental and governance. And I think actually, as kind of funds who typically fund a great deal of the private sector that is being developed, move themselves into this social area, they're going to start to think about, how can I actually measure my effectiveness at deploying capital into these areas? And actually, one of the ways of doing it is to start thinking about what those targeted interventions about affordability are going to be. I'm joining a lot of dots here that I hope are going to be joined by the people, who are strategizing this. But, instead of just having this wonderful, rent increase that you've been able to deploy, and looking at how you can outpace inflation, which, in many kind of ways of thinking would be great, great to have a whole sector. That's why so much capital is looking at this market. That's why the private sector is expanding so quickly. But actually, if you were to think that average rent increase could be, along the rent ladder. So yes, I'm going to achieve this midpoint, but I'm going to do it by looking at that, top end of affordable, the non-affordable stuff, the stuff that does target the internationals, the stuff that does go further, provide more, think differently about services, differentiate itself. When it is linked to the other end of the market, to say, actually, I'm interested in affordability and I'm interested in how I can demonstrate that to my shareholders or to whoever and to students. When all those kind of planets align, I think you start to get something quite important. And so the London Plan is the first domino in that chain, but it's not quite there yet, because what you don't have at the moment is it targeted sufficiently pinpointing UK students, you know, the affordability aspect needs to look at who needs it most. And I think the next iteration of strategies from, you know, happy to chat, you know, how we might do this. It's about getting everyone on the same page there. But I do think that the way that, you know, the capital is moving is actually going to look at this a lot more. Long answer, sorry.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Have we got one final question you want to?
Yeah, we've got one. There's a final one actually that's been sent in right at the start, and I promised to do two at the start.
Fine. Okay, we'll do.
So
Well,
I feel like duty bound to this person.
Let's do 2 minutes each
to try and do this one. Which they make the point with construction inflation flying well above RPI and HMO legislation in Scotland, adding significant costs to maintaining buildings. It's naive to think rent increases can stay below RPI, which I think we agree, and we touched on that in the session. But could or should more be done by NUS to level up with loan levels in Scotland, as it's utterly unfair that it's lower than my screen moved than in England, and the cost of living in Scotland is expensive. So I know NUS put out or contributed a lot to the press release that's gone out in Scotland today with some comments from your president in Scotland. But I don't know if you've got any comments, Hilary, on how NUS can do more to try and more for students in Scotland.
I mean, I agree with everything that NUS Scotland said. NUS Scottish President said.
Now that would be a headline if you hadn't said that. Yeah.
No, I generally agree with everything Matt says.
Four nations fall out.
No, never. No, what I would say is that I think NUS Scotland are doing a lot actually to support on this, from, you know, the stuff that they've obviously talked about in the press release today, but also, you know, campaigns on the summer student support payment. And so I think there's lots to be said that, you know, fortunately in Scotland they have, and this is with all the shade included, they have a government that works with them and you know, sort of works closely to speak on things like this. And so I think NUS Scotland are pushing quite hard, and I think they're not letting up just yet. But genuinely, I think the sort of focus that they have not only on the housing aspect, but also the cost of living in Scotland, and they did a lot of work on that last year, and that's sort of spilled into this year. Coupled with the student support payment in the summer, and the work that they're doing now in continuing to push the government to do more, I think there's much to be said for the work that they're continuing to thrive in there. But I agree, just for the record, I agree with Matt Crilly on everything he said in that press release, and that's all I can say to that.
Okay. Yeah. Let's just pick up your as a final question.
I just want to make a couple of comments rather than answer the question. Firstly,
yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments rather than ask any questions particularly. I wanted to sort of come back on Nick's comment about this seeming mystery as to why students book the most expensive accommodation first. And the answer is quite simple. Students are marketed at, and students are 18-year-old, inexperienced young adults who want the shiniest, newest, best experience from accommodation. That's why they sign up to that quickly. It's not a mystery. They think about the cost of it secondary, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence to support that. So I just wanted to say that. And the second comment is around affordability. One of the words that hasn't been used in this, there isn't a single solution for this, and certainly not building affordable halls is an answer in itself, because from my experience, and I've been working in student accommodation more than 20 years now, if you have affordable halls, and we've tried this, they become stigmatised. And that drives students away from going to those halls. So I just wanted to get that out there as well.
Yeah, well, it has to be carefully allocated. That's the reality. You don't have a poor student hall. I think that's what's being suggested at all. I mean, I think, by the way, the point you made, I mean, what hasn't been made, I think, so far today, is that we will see that we're also seeing fewer and fewer students being housed in what I'm going to call off-street housing, in traditional community housing, which is about 50% cheaper. And that supply, because of planning restrictions and so on, quite rightly imposed. But that supply is effectively corseted and is also declining. As Julie mentioned, landlords leaving the scene.
But also with city councils, like in Oxford, imposing limits on their amount of students who can live in PBSA.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's going down. And therefore, more people are going to live in PBSA as returning students, and that's already happening. And by the way, they're facing a 40 or 50% rent increase under the current system. So, yeah, so if we're talking about how do students afford student housing, I mean, the idea that you spend £7,000 a year for 3 years isn't what happens at the moment. What happens at the moment is you spend 7,000 and then about 5 and then about 5. So that's a big rent increase just because of the nature of the stock. Final comment, Nick?
Well, first of all, I don't think we're disagreeing, because I think my plea for the A and the G, the advice and the guidance, as well as the information, is partly to make sure marketing information is not the only thing that's getting into the hands of these people. But if I could just say two other quick things. The first is, there are a couple of things that haven't been mentioned this morning that we should remember are hovering over us. So the government has yet, nearly 3 years on, is yet to respond to the Auger report. The Auger report had a recommendation that the Office for Students should do a study of student cost of living with a particular focus on rents. That is something hovering over us all. The government probably won't respond to now until the new year, but nonetheless, I think that it would be wrong to close this meeting without mentioning that. And the other thing, of course, is that we started with history, is when politicians do start worrying about all this stuff, their answer is very often, well, more students should live at home. So what Margaret Thatcher wanted when she was Secretary of State for Education in Ted Heath's government, partly because her own daughter Carol lived at home. It's what John Denham wanted when in New Labour's years. It's what, across the political spectrum, that is sometimes their answer. So the other risk here is if the costs get too high, politicians are more likely to say, well, more of them should live at home than they are to sit back and go, well, let's double the maintenance loan package because of the underlying drivers on government finance. And then, can I just make a plea for capitalism at the end? Because there's been a lot of attack of capitalism. I mean, I actually disagree quite fundamentally with Ruth, if I may say so, because, for example, she talked about over-expanding institutions in Bristol. If people want to go and study in Bristol, and Bristol institutions want to accept them, that is basically a public good. We should not be, the thing I'm proudest to have worked on in my entire career, it's not the tripling of tuition fees, but it's a policy that flew naturally from that, which was removal of student number caps, which allows more people, yesterday's UCAS data, 81% of people are getting their first choice university. That is a fantastic thing. We should not be closing the door on potential learners who could be thriving at these institutions. And it's why I also fundamentally disagree with the Scottish system, where it's very, very, very costly. And one of the consequences of that is, yes, there's not enough cash in pocket for living costs. Another consequence of that is they still have student number caps. And the door is being slammed in the face of potential learners who would benefit from higher education personally and from whom the country would benefit. So I think underlying all of this, we've been focusing on the criticisms and the problems, but there's also a real positive. We've got more learners than ever before, higher education's expanding, more people are going to university, and that is a really good, and most of them have a fantastic time when they're there, not all of them. There is, of course, a mental health crisis, and most of them succeed with their degree afterwards, and that is a positive, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I mean, but it's interesting, because Julie's now left us, and one of Julie Rugg's recommendations in one of her early reports before 2009 was that universities should do housing impact assessments on their expansion. She never persuaded her own university to do that before they opened Heslington East. So as a policy recommendation, it didn't go far. But I think it was a good idea, so that actually people don't just say we're expanding, and I'm sure the housing market will sort itself out, because it really won't. And you do need a university and a local authority, and actually at the moment a private sector develop a strategy to kind of approach that. And without that, I think there are problems. We've seen some of the critical housing shortages in Sussex, for Sussex University, being eased a bit by the university deciding to spend an awful lot of money in building a lot of accommodation on its campus. It wasn't on to just go pumping people into the Brighton private rented sector forever. So I think there are solutions to that, but people have to work on it. But I quite like the idea that an educational institution doesn't just say, hey, we're going to expand, and we hope everything will work out somehow. So perhaps perhaps a little bit more joined up thinking. By the way, it costs nobody anything, that's just people talking to each other. Okay, well, you've all been very good, and we've overrun by 15 minutes, as I warned you we probably might, in an indirect way. You all get a star for staying for the extra 15 minutes. We'll be handing them out as you leave. I think there's some tea and coffee outside, is that right, or something?
Think so. Hope
Possibly.
so.
Well, if there is something outside, feel free to stick around. I'd like to thank, closing remarks, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank everyone for being involved, and hopefully this report is helpful to you, and all the facts are there so you can make your own mind up. Thank you very much, and thanks to the panel. Thank you.